You're listening to a 3CR podcast of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia.
Radio MMT respectfully acknowledges the traditional custodians of the land from which we are broadcasting, the Wurundjeri people, and we are broadcasting to the Kulin Nations. Our focus is economics, that is, how stuff is produced and distributed. We recognise that for many tens of thousands of years, First Nations people's connection to country successfully embodied the world's oldest continuous economy, which was catastrophically disrupted by genocide and displacement. We acknowledge that we have much to learn to reshape our current extractive and exploitive system to achieve sustainable prosperity for everyone.
Radio MMT. Economics for the rest of us with Anne
and Kev.
Radio MMT.
Looking at the world through the lens of modern monetary theory.
Radio MMT. Macroeconomics for a well-being economy.
Macroeconomics? Isn't that incredibly boring?
No, Kevin, it's incredibly interesting. It's all about who gets what and why.
Who gets what and why? Okay, I'm in.
RadioMMT@gmail.com.
Incredibly interesting macroeconomics for the rest of us. Welcome to another episode of Radio MMT. How are you this week, Anne?
Not too bad, Kevin. I can feel summer is definitely started up.
Yeah, it's nice to get the chill behind.
Although I'm nowhere near a beach to enjoy it.
Oh, well. This week we're talking to a friend of yours who was a former colleague.
Former comrade in arms, Kevin.
And when we did that recording, I was actually at the beach. I was at a place called Seal Rocks at that particular time in the back of my truck when we did the recording, looking at whales actually just lolling around, just flapping their fins around. There's a pod of whales just hanging out in the bay in front of me. It was lovely.
Yeah, we are going to go back to that conversation that we had with Owen Bennett, who was a founding member, if not the founder, of the Australian Unemployed Workers Union. And in fact, the Unemployed Workers Union does have an ongoing show here at 3CR Community Radio. It's called Breadline, and you can find that on 3cr.org.au. But I do credit Owen for introducing me to MMT, Kevin.
Oh, here's your intro to MMT. Very good, yeah. I can't remember how I got introduced to it. I think I saw it online somewhere and then followed a link and then ended up with the Australian Workers' Party, and that's when I really got into it. That was a few years ago. Funny the way people get roped into this.
Yeah, well, we had one of our nice long conversations with Owen, and we will be airing it over 2 episodes of Radio MMT. So in the first half of our conversation today, we will be discussing the current state of genuine full employment activism in Australia. And then in the second half of our conversation, we'll be looking at the history of genuine full employment activism in Australia and what activists today might learn from that history.
Yes.
So, it's all about full employment, Kevin, and I can easily forget that not everyone gets immediately all fired up about this concept of full employment, and certainly back in the day I would have glazed over if someone tried talking to me about it.
And I think we throw this term around, full employment, but it's important to understand that there's more than one definition of full employment. Full employment would appear to be when everybody who is looking for a job has a job. You would call that full employment. But
you would assume, wouldn't you?
But that's not how it's done these days.
No. So that's why I have to say genuine full employment to distinguish it from the full employment that people like the Reserve Bank talk about. But when we talk about genuine full employment, I've started to see it as a necessary foundation for a better future. At a minimum, you could take a reformist approach to genuine full employment, which means that via a job guarantee, you could implement full employment as fast as JobKeeper and JobSeeker were changed during the COVID lockdowns, which was literally within weeks. And if we did that, we could immediately lift hundreds of thousands of Australians out of abject poverty. So if you take just a simple reformist approach, at a minimum, we would be ending poverty in one foul swoop, which did happen in that spending during the COVID lockdowns.
Well, we saw poverty knocked on the head because they doubled the dole overnight, and people were engaged or paid not to work, essentially. That was their job, was to stay at home and don't spread the virus. And you could say that the government employed people to stay at home and try not to kill each other.
That's where you can kind of expand the definition of what employment might be. Employment can be anything that you're paid to do, including not to work.
Yeah, well, yeah. If you're engaged in useful activity, then yeah. But that's a little unusual. There's other ways that the government could become a lot more involved in the economy to stimulate what we would sort of regard as regular employment.
Mm-hmm. And you could even take a more revolutionary approach to full employment, because we could see it as the foundation of an eco-socialist or a well-being economy, where we are completely changing how we do our economy to make that transition to decarbonise, or a degrowing economy. And so a full employment economy can be a way to look after everyone while you're making that transition. And of course, as you're saying, the government can get a lot more involved via what we might call universal basic services. So we know the government has the money to spend on things like aged care,
health, education, the care economy, all that sort of stuff.
All the good stuff.
A lot of this, it comes down to ideology. What we're exploring is the options that are available and remove the myths and the misinformation about the economic roadblocks when people say they can't afford this and they can't afford that. Our job is to say, well, yes, they can, and they do when they want to, and they could all the time.
Yes, we're using the MMT lens to reveal what is really going on when they're telling us things like they can't afford to give us these universal basic goodies that we think everyone should have. And when we think of full employment, I personally think of it as genuine economic inclusivity, along the lines of that famous phrase you might have heard, Kevin, from each according to their ability to each according to their need.
Who said, where'd that come from?
I think it was some dude called Carl.
Excellent.
And I guess some of the counter arguments, which is, why should we be trying to fight to get people into jobs? Shouldn't we be fighting to set people free from work? And I think people are thinking that way because, unfortunately, work has become synonymous with exploitation. You know, I am a believer that work does not have to be exploitative. I think of it as actual, meaningful, dignified, self-determined work.
If work was defined as things that are genuinely useful and done in a way that isn't exploiting the worker, where they're not being overworked or underpaid, well, then work becomes less onerous, you know.
You know, we could even be paying people 1 day a week to participate in direct democracy processes like citizens' assemblies, because I hear a lot of people say they just don't have time to lift their heads up and think about the kinds of changes we want to make or need to make. Well, we could just pay people to think about it.
Yeah, there's all sorts of things that are useful.
Yeah, we just have to use our imaginations. Well, let's head into that conversation that we had with Owen Bennett about full employment activism. I'm so pleased to be able to speak with Owen Bennett today. Owen and I go back a little ways, back to when Owen was a founding member of the Australian Unemployed Workers Union. And since then, he has been continuing to research the history of trade unions and unemployment in Australia. Owen, welcome to Radio MMT, and I believe you're working on a book on that topic now.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you, Anne. Yes, very pleased to say I've finished my thesis on this and trying to adapt that into a book.
It is thanks to researchers like yourself, Owen, that I've come to understand that getting to a full employment economy is a pivotal issue. And I think that it's linked to the well-being of all workers and also transitioning away from carbon to renewables and even to degrowing the economy and doing that in a way that supports all workers and doesn't harm people. So I've got lots of reasons to be interested in a full employment economy. To get to a situation where all workers who want to work have a job. And recently you had an article published in the Jacobin, which is an American socialist magazine, That article was published on the 30th of July 2024, and it was called Australia's Labour Movement Has Abandoned Unemployed Workers. Before we get to some of the history on that, maybe we could start by looking at what is the unemployment and underemployment situation in Australia at the moment, and have things improved at all since Labor took office in May 2022?
A very good place to start. The amount of unemployed and underemployed people is very much pushed aside when we start talking about the economy in our society, because when you look at it, it's quite alarming. The statistics are a little bit complicated because you've got the formal unemployment rate, which is the level that is collected by the ABS, and that's people who are in the labour force and are actively looking for work as defined by the ABS. And that's the figure that we see in the news a lot, which is currently 4.2%. That's about 650,000 odd people who are in the system, so to speak. Job seeker payment, they're in the unemployment system. They're getting churned through the employment services system, mutual obligation system. Now that level has actually decreased a fair bit since before COVID, when the average was about 5 to 6%. So a lot of people are sort of patting themselves on the back about that, but that doesn't tell the full story. When you talk about unemployment, you have to talk about the amount of people looking for jobs. So you have to include the underemployed. And the ABS collect two different sets of data on this, which is interesting. They collect the amount of underemployed people, so people who are working but want more hours. And that's been about 1 million people for a little while. Recently, they've started collecting an expanded underemployment data set, which is really interesting because that takes into account people who maybe are working full-time hours but also want more, because there's a lot of people who want more overtime and people getting squeezed left, right and centre. A lot of people who already have full-time work want more work. So that's well over 1 million people on that.
Just on that, you're saying that there's a bunch of full-time people that want more work. That to me sounds like the wrong phrasing. If you're working full-time and you want more work, you don't want more work, you want more money. Because what you're being paid isn't enough. So now we have this other factor, which is that economic conditions are such that even when you're working full-time, you can't make ends meet.
Yeah, definitely. And the real wage has been going backwards, over the last 10 years or so. So, yeah, there's all those pressures on those people to get more hours wherever they can. And then on top of that, you've got the hidden unemployed. That they're people who have been pushed out of the labour force. They're not formally looking for jobs, but I think most economists who look at those people would say, well, if the jobs were there, they would be trying to get those jobs if they were suitable for them. And that is a massive, massive pool of people. That's really, really alarming. And it's really alarming how little attention is paid to them, because they're victims of our mass unemployment economy. And that's there are almost 2 million people who are amongst what I call the hidden unemployed. And they're also counted by the ABS. So when you look at all of that, today there's 3.5 million people, going by the latest data, who want work but are not finding it. And that has increased quite a lot since when Albanese first got into office. When Albanese first got in, it was about 3 million people who were looking for work. And now that's 3.5 million people. So it's a total crisis. And when you consider people talking about how the labour market's too tight, it's just not true.
The labour market is still easing, but it remains relatively tight. And we saw again last week solid growth in jobs. The need to maintain a restrictive monetary policy stance and remain vigilant to the upside risks to inflation.
What's it all about? It's about inflation being too high.
RBA Deputy Governor Michelle Bullock says our unemployment rate will need to rise to 4.5%. That's to tame inflation, so the unemployment rate's got to rise.
Unemployment rate's got to rise. This is what Michelle Bullock was saying. Basically saying it needs to get to 4.5%. And just doing the maths on the back of a napkin, that's about 140,000 jobs that need to be lost in Australia's economy. Why does the unemployment rate need to go up? Well, if there are less people working, there's less demand being put into the economy. Less people are earning money, they're not spending that money in the economy, they're not pushing up inflation. So it's one of the ways to bring down inflation is a higher unemployment rate.
Is it groupthink? Is it groupthink? 4.5%.
What is full employment? The right level of employment for the country where everyone that has a job wants a job. That's apparently about 4.5%.
Do you factor in the human cost? How much of that human cost are you factoring in?
The government and the Reserve Bank have the same definition of full employment, 4.5% right now. Like, when you look at those comments, you know, it beggars belief how they could come up with that sort of analysis when you think there's 3.5 million people who actually want work. And that should be the starting point for any discussion about, you know, our economy.
You're listening to 3CR 855 AM on digital and on the internet. www.3cr.org.au.
So when we hear politicians and policymakers saying that the labour market is too tight, that is code for them saying employment is too high, meaning unemployment is not high enough.
And just on that, if you're a worker and you hear the term full employment, then you're thinking about all the workers who want to work, have jobs. But that's not how the government or business refers to full employment. They regard full employment at a level where they can keep workers hungry enough to keep downward pressure on wages. And they say that this is to curb inflation. But I have a very sneaking suspicion that it's more to do about increasing profits than it is about decreasing inflation. They use words that seem socially acceptable. But the reality is, if wages are low, your profit margins are higher. And nobody ever talks about that. But it's the same consequence. You know, if you keep your overheads down, your profit margin increases.
Right.
And that's exactly the same mechanism as they claim by keeping inflation down. And this comes down to the definition of full employment. If any government that accepts the NAIRU as a legitimate tool is adopting a neoliberal policy. So from a neoliberal perspective, full employment is the level at which you can contain wages. And that doesn't mean employing everybody. That just means keeping wages down so that you can keep inflation down or keep your profits up.
Yeah, it is real Orwellian doublespeak, isn't it, when they say full employment, but what they really mean is some level of unemployment, and at the moment that level is 4.5%, which is more than 500,000 people.
It's been 6% and 8% in the past.
Well, if you would like to hear the sound of an economic hitman using the NAIRU, the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, look no further than Sarah Hunter, who is Assistant Governor of Economics at the RBA. Back on the 11th of September 2024, Sarah Hunter gave a keynote address to the Barrenjoey Economic Forum, where her speech was titled Understanding the Journey to Full Employment. And you know, Kevin, Sarah is such a lovely, sincere-sounding girl, especially when she opens with remarks that sound so sympathetic to the plight of the unemployed. But in the next breath, she spouts the idea that full employment is the rate consistent with low, stable inflation. And she asserts that the labour market is too tight, meaning unemployment is too low.
Dr. Sarah Hunter, Assistant Governor for Economics at the Reserve Bank of Australia.
So employment is crucial to our living standards and our lives. A job is not just a source of income. For many of us, it is also a key part of our identity and way of life. Those that experience a period of unemployment can suffer for a long time afterwards, and the economy can lose, as it were, their skills and expertise. The Reserve Bank Board has historically set monetary policy to achieve both low and stable inflation and full employment. Our full employment mandate became more explicit in the updated statement on the conduct of monetary policy that was agreed between the Reserve Bank Board and the Treasurer late last year. So first, starting with our definition of full employment. Well, bear with me, it's a bit of an economist definition coming up. We define full employment as the maximum level of employment that is consistent with low and stable inflation. When the economy is at full employment, demand and supply in the labour market are in balance. In turn, this means wages grow at a rate consistent with achieving the...
But now we are facing a wonderful future. Gone are the winters we've always endured. For our unemployment is now for enjoyment. Come April the 1st, we will all be insured.
It's easy to describe. Unfortunately, it's rather more difficult to measure or capture in a single metric. So, while the unemployment rate is a key metric, we do consider a range of different measures to holistically assess the labour market. These include leading indicators such as firms' employment intentions, measures of unmet demand such as vacancies, and other cyclical measures of underutilisation such as the medium-term and youth unemployment rates and the underemployment rate. So, our current assessment is that the labour market is operating above full employment but has moved towards better balance since late 2022. So the job finding rate, that's the proportion of those that are unemployed that find a job in any given month, we can see that this has declined. So this observation is consistent with people taking a little bit longer to find work if they're looking for it. And all else equal, this dynamic does contribute to a higher unemployment rate.
For though we're not schoolboys, we bow to the rule boys. So we've begun our collection of stamps.
Now, the layoffs rate is always positive. There are always some firms restructuring, repositioning, perhaps closing down. And again, we know for the people that are impacted by that, the individuals, that that's a challenging situation for them to face. And it's also the case that the layoffs rate has been trending up recently. And our assessment is that this is consistent with the labour market loosening from very tight conditions, but still operating above full employment.
Our benefit starts, and we'll be men of parts. Sit back and do nothing for the rest of the year.
Measures of underutilisation, including the unemployment rate, are expected to continue rising gradually from here. Well, to sum up, conditions in the labour market have eased since late 2022, but our assessment is that the labour market is still tight relative to full employment. We expect the demand for labour to grow at a slower pace relative to the supply in the coming quarters, gradually bringing the labour market into better balance.
That just sort of shows me, Kevin, that getting women into these roles does not change the roles themselves. So female economists, they're just as willing as male economists to rationalise these heartless decisions which throw unemployed people under the bus. And while the gender struggle is important, the class struggle, I think it's the bigger nut to crack.
Yeah, and it shows that anybody can be usurped by the neoliberal Kool-Aid, and we've known that ever since Maggie Thatcher, really. So it goes back.
It's so true. Let's head back to our conversation with Owen Bennett. We are going to take it as read today that unemployment is not a good thing. In fact, it's a cruel way of putting the handbrakes on an economy and undermining the well-being of everyone involved. And we talked a lot about that with John Haley and Martha Knox Haley in a previous show that people can go and listen to. But you were saying, Owen, in your article that Labor is running an austerity program at the moment. So I was wondering, what do we mean by austerity and what sort of things is Labor up to in this, and what is the likely effect of austerity on unemployment?
I think a good way to start thinking about austerity is what the government is contributing to the economy. So the government is spending X amount of money, and if the government decides they want to start decreasing the amount of money they're putting in through their budget, then that's a cut in government expenditure, and that's when we start talking about austerity, because they're actually reducing their input. For some people it might seem a bit hidden because there isn't like the big slashing and burning that we see under the Conservatives. But if you look at their budgets, I mean, in their September 2023 budget, the Labor government passed a budget which had a surplus of $22 billion.
That means that they're taxing more than they're spending.
Yeah, so they're essentially taking out of the economy $22 billion, which has a huge impact on how that economy functions. And that, mind you, is the biggest surplus in Australian history in money terms. Like, there's never been a bigger surplus. And if that was a Conservative government doing that, you'd have the whole progressive movement saying what an outrage that is, because they're essentially cutting all that money. But because it's Labor, they kind of get away with these austerity ideas. And the recent budget in May as well was also a big surplus budget. I can't remember the figure off the top of my head. I think it was about 10 billion or something like that.
Yeah, 10 billion, yeah.
So there's like a huge amount of money that's been taken out of the economy by the Labor government in various areas, and we can't really get into all the details of that. But I think it's worth thinking about why that is. And, I mean, on the face of it, you look at the budget papers and you scroll through some of their rationale, and a really important rationale for the Labor government is they want to increase unemployment. So in their forward estimates, they have it very clearly in there that they want to see unemployment up to 4.5%. And a big impact, of course, of austerity and reducing government expenditure is that there's less economic activity, which means there's generally a downturn, and that means higher unemployment. So for Labor, they want to keep taking money out of the economy until they get at least an unemployment rate of 4.5%. And that also conforms with what the Reserve Bank is saying. They want unemployment higher to be 4.5% as well, because this is their magic bullet for curing,
inflation.
Yeah. So really, Labor and the Reserve Bank are in lockstep on this one, even though the mainstream media was playing up this idea that Jim Chalmers, our Federal Treasurer, was accusing the RBA of smashing the economy.
Yeah, and that's just a big distraction. They've been using that tool to deflect responsibility for a long time. They claim, falsely that the Reserve Bank is independent and we just got to do what they say. But that's not true. Like, they have legislation which means they could intervene at any point and suspend the decision-making powers of the Reserve Bank and just cut interest rates themselves. But there's reasons why they don't want to do that.
So with Labor at the moment, they're playing two games. On the one hand, they're trying to increase minimum wages for, the care economy, etc., and take credit for that sort of thing. But on the other hand, they're still firmly in the NAIRU camp, the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment camp, where they believe that throwing people on the unemployment heap will address inflation. And we've talked about that many times on this show. Is there any credibility to the NAIRU, or should that be heresy amongst Labor politicians?
Yeah, I think so. And there's a long history of the Labor movement fiercely opposing any idea that we need higher unemployment to bring down inflation. Like that goes back since World War II, really. So there's a long history of arguing that is completely reprehensible idea that we need more unemployed to decrease interest rates and make a stable economy. Labor has had a bit of wiggle room on this recently with their white paper on employment, which was initially called the white paper on full employment, but they got rid of the full employment reference, and maybe we'll get back to that later. But in that white paper, they talked a bit about NAIRU, and they said actually the NAIRU has its problems, and it acknowledged some of those problems. So exactly what you said, Kevin, they're trying to be in two camps. They're trying to say, there are issues with the NAIRU, there are issues with our use of unemployment as a way to bring down inflation, but they just do it anyway. And that is the weakness, I think, of the Labor Party. And when we start talking about the 3.5 million people who are looking for work, that's why Labor never talk about that, because that really exposes just how brutal this policy is. There's already 4.2% unemployed, 3.5 million looking for work. They want to push more people out of work, more people onto the poverty payment of the job seeker allowance, which is about $200 per fortnight below the poverty line, at least. They want to push more people into poverty as a way to, secure the prosperity of the economy. Yeah, when you step back and look at that, you think, what kind of society is this? I think in 1,000 years' time, they're going to look back on this time and think, what were they thinking?
It's very medieval.
You might have to wait 1,000 years. There's a lot of people already think that right now. It seems to me that Labor is trying to appease this neoliberal ideology at the same time that they're supposed to be representing workers, and they seem too scared to challenge that neoliberal narrative. So it's almost like they're captured by it.
Yeah, I think that's right. And that's the story of social democratic parties across the world. John Quiggin, he talks about soft neoliberal and hard neoliberal parties. And a lot of social democratic parties like the Labour Party in Britain, Australia, the Democrats in America, they've adopted a kind of a soft neoliberal line where they're trying to have sort of neoliberalism with a human face. But that's just a road to disaster, and that's what we've seen in Britain, because it's shocking the amount of austerity policies being introduced by Starmer. It's tearing the Labour Party up, and that's what's going to happen in Australia if there isn't a genuine kind of grassroots organisation pushing for greater action on the unemployment crisis that we have.
You're with Anne and Kev on Radio MMT.
At 3CR Community Radio in Melbourne, Australia.
And wherever you get your podcasts.
Economics for the rest of us. Going back to that moment when Labor did write a white paper, that was back in September 2023, and that was coming shortly after the COVID lockdowns of 2020-2021, where supposedly the minds of our economic decision makers were opened to the possibilities that come with the capacity of the federal government to spend new dollars into the economy. Now, I personally did not see all that much change in the ideology that we're talking about here, because all of that spending was couched in a story that said, well, we can only do this in a crisis and we'll need to pay back that debt at some point. I didn't hear many people saying that the public purse should be used to pursue the public good all of the time. So you followed some of the impact of this historic moment of this unprecedented government spending. And I was just wondering what you saw at that time.
Yeah, well, the politics of unemployment and full employment is really fascinating. On the Labor side of politics, they've got this really kind of inferiority complex where they think they can't come out and talk about big vision projects about full employment, because if they do, they'll get smashed by the Conservatives as like spending like drunken sailors and all the rest of that nonsense. So they've been so hesitant ever since full employment was abandoned in 1975 to actually talk about seriously combating our mass unemployment problem. But that all changed in March 2020, where at the height of COVID, you had the Morrison government sort of came out of nowhere with this policy of doubling the dole, putting it at the poverty line for the first time since Fraser. And then on the other hand, they were talking about JobKeeper policy, which was a mass wage subsidy policy, which is going to be $130 billion or whatever, which is sort of a roundabout way of saying the government's going to step in and ensure these jobs stick around.
Yeah, I remember thinking at the time that the government had literally taken on about a third of the payroll of the country.
Yeah, and it was unprecedented, and nobody saw this coming from the progressive side, that's for sure. Like, I was involved in the Unemployed Workers Union at that time, and in our wildest dreams, we never thought that the Liberals would come out and double the dole. And so I think it caused a seismic shift in the way politics occurred on economic questions. The Labor movement, I think, realised that they were just being completely outflanked by the Liberals, by the Conservatives. The Conservatives had far more vision about government intervention, using the fiscal levers available to them. They wanted to go in and really help people. And, I think it was pretty brave,
Who's advising them to do that? Because it's so against their ideology. Is this just Treasury, possibly with the experience of the GFC, saying if you don't do something, the economy is going to collapse?
They had no choice, did they? I'm sure they had no choice.
I think we should be cautious about giving them too much credit, because ultimately they just wanted to sustain the economy, and they don't have the ideological baggage that the left has. They can see that this was bad for capitalism, it was bad for capital, bad for business to have complete lack of demand. So they don't have that kind of baggage that Labor would have when it comes to, if we're going to be smashed, because the Liberals obviously know they're not going to be criticised by the left on it. But just to answer your question, Kevin, I was interested to hear that Frydenberg, who's the Treasurer, he talked about, when he was thinking about this policy, he called up none other than John Howard to try to get his opinion on it. And John Howard said, don't be restrained by ideology. Do what is right for essentially the employing class.
We were staring into an economic abyss. Treasury in Australia had come to me and said, Treasurer, the unemployment rate in Australia could reach as high as 15%. That would see more than 2 million Australians unemployed. On the weekend before we announced JobKeeper, I was walking around Parliament House and I rang John Howard. And I said, John, we're about to announce an economy-wide wage subsidy with an eye-watering cost. I'd never thought that as a Liberal Treasurer, I'd be announcing such a policy.
Josh said, look, we've got to inject this enormous amount of money. He said, it'll send us way into debt. And I said, you don't have any alternative.
He said, Josh, at times of national crises, there are no ideological constraints. And for me, that was a critical judgment from Australia's second longest serving Prime Minister that we were on the right track.
Former Liberal Federal Treasurer Josh Frydenberg and former Liberal Prime Minister John Howard in Episode 3 of the ABC documentary series Nemisis.
He got Johnny's stamp of approval,
Okay.
and that gave him some of the guts to go and do that. And
not just his approval, he got John Howard to say, "Abandon your ideology," which I think is an extraordinary statement from John Howard.
But it snapped back pretty quick, I reckon.
Yeah, it did, and it was a massive opportunity for the left to come in and say, well, this is possible, and to actually dedicate serious campaigning resources to making sure that things don't go back. And there were encouraging signs. It was, partly because of embarrassment, partly because they really wanted it, but the Labor movement really kicked into gear and started talking about full employment in a way they hadn't since the full employment period in the post-war time. And the ACTU came out and very quickly started talking about, this was mid-2020, started talking about, we want to go back to the full employment golden days of the post-war period, of the Curtin government, and they started really referencing that storied history.
Wow, everyone started harking back to the golden era.
Yeah, all of a sudden,
Okay.
out of nowhere. I mean, forgetting the fact we've been having a mass unemployment economy built in since the mid-70s, actively supported by Labor parties. So they started talking about that, and the ACTU had, I think it was called a National Reconstruction Plan, which was mid-2020, and then this gave room to a huge amount of really exciting activism that was going on. So there was Young Labor for full employment. They wanted to try to do some work inside the Labor tent to get them to have a stronger position on this. And then there was other activist groups like the Tomorrow Movement, and they started doing really good stuff, talking about a climate job guarantee, saying that we need to eliminate involuntary unemployment from the economy altogether. And it was a really exciting time. It got to the point where the pressure on Albanese was pretty strong, so he announced a white paper for full employment, and he said that if he gets into government, so this was from opposition, that he would implement a white paper on full employment. And there were people like me licking our lips were thinking, this is great, we just need to sustain this and keep the pressure on. But then it all kind of just sort of poof, it all kind of disappeared when Albanese got elected. And the white paper itself, they changed the name of it. They did the full employment reference just poof disappeared, and then all those kind of activist movements, the Young Labor for full employment, they poof disappeared, and they all kind of went away because all that kind of anxiety that Labor has always felt about being too strong on the economy, and made a lot of people think we can't put pressure on the Labor government because that'll embarrass them, and that could be a problem for them politically down the line, particularly when the opposition was, desperately trying to retreat from their big spending policies of the past. So that became a political problem for the Labor government. And for whatever reason, a lot of those peripheral groups just toned it down. And today we're in a period where there just isn't much talk about trying to go back to putting pressure on the government about eliminating involuntary unemployment.
Well, let's start that conversation right here, right now, Owen. And see if we can't look at what it might look like to start campaigning for a full employment economy. Because I have to say, for myself, I can get a little bit despondent about it. It does seem like an impossible task to get to a point where no one who wants to work is involuntarily unemployed. And in fact, as we mentioned earlier, both sides of government, Labor and Liberal, do vie each other to run the budget surpluses, which means government spending less, which means that if there's unemployment, it will simply maintain or go up. And so give me some reason to hope that, we might get some kind of movement going to create an economy that's not set up primarily to knock down workers.
Yeah, well, this is where the politics of full employment is really interesting. I mean, even the Liberals, to some extent, talk about they don't want to see unemployment. No one in politics is going to go up in front of an audience and say, we want higher levels of unemployment. They're not going to emphasise that, and they're going to try to play lip service to the idea to some degree of ensuring that people have access to employment. How they define that definitely changes, and that's the same with the union movement. So the union movement have a strong, on paper, commitment to full employment. Like the recent ACTU Congress, I think it was in March this year, they passed a very strong policy on full employment. Their policies actually are for genuine, what we call true full employment, and they're very clear on that. They want to see the elimination of involuntary unemployment in their formal policies. So there's a lot of different groups that pay lip service to full employment in various ways. The Greens, they're the same, that they want a Green New Deal to eliminate involuntary unemployment. Other left groups like Victorian Socialists, they have this in their policy that they want to see unemployment eliminated. And it's really kind of become like a motherhood statement to a degree. And it looks nice on paper, and people feel satisfied when they pass these motions and resolutions and like, oh, we've done a good thing here. But then there's doing something about it. And that's where I see the problem. And there are groups that come up sort of outside of the traditional left structures, like the Tomorrow Movement were a really exciting group that came and said, we're going to actually do something about this. And they had a march on Canberra in 2022, the first week of Parliament, when Albanese took office, and they started chanting in the foyer, wanting a climate jobs guarantee. And it looked like there was going to be like the foundations of a genuine full employment movement to put pressure on government and try and sort of call them out on this, because they're clearly vulnerable. They're talking about full employment, but they don't do anything about it. And the unions are similar. They talk about it, but in terms of action, it's pretty hard pressed to find any action, to the point where most people would think they don't talk about it. Well, they do. It's just buried. It's buried underneath reams of policy documents that they don't really want to talk about for fear of embarrassing the Labor government, I think. So that's where I think a grassroots activist movement can really do some important work, is just pointing out the obvious, pointing out that this is what you talk about, so let's do something about it. And you can use that to try to bring groups together that might ordinarily wouldn't be dedicating resources to it, and sort of lead them in that direction. And you might remember the Unemployed Workers Union. We had some success in that area, where a lot of groups sort of they agree with the general idea of helping unemployed people. It's hard to get them to do something on their own. So if you got a group, like sending an email saying, hey, do you want to sign this open letter saying we want no unemployment and decent job seeker rate and all the rest of it, it's kind of hard for them to say no to that. So if you get more groups doing that work and just building coalitions...
It's like articulating a latent sort of attitude, isn't it?
Yeah, and they need to be led, unfortunately. And then maybe when you do that, you kind of start building a genuine appetite for this sort of thing. And I think that's what needs to be done now. This is a long project, but you start building those foundations for left-wing activism. And that goes back to a bit of my research on this, where that's kind of what happened in the post-war period, where there was really huge amounts of effort over decades and decades trying to build a genuine movement against unemployment, and it worked. That was part of the reason why full employment stuck around for so long after World War II.
Something did change with that COVID spend-up that we had, which saw the government putting billions of dollars into programs known as JobKeeper and JobSeeker. And that was that we started to see a public conversation about genuine full employment. As Owen was saying, the left had to move to the left and start talking about genuine full employment instead of this fake full employment to 4.5% unemployment. And I will admit that I was one of the people who missed that change, because I'm so cynical that when they talked full employment, I did not think they were talking genuine full employment. And I did not see past my own cynicism to see that this was buried in these documents that Owen has had a good look at, and I've had a brief glance at some of these documents. So I guess the point is that if we have had this shift, that the Labor Party and civil society organisations are now at least paying lip service to genuine full employment, then now we do have this opportunity to hold them to it.
Well, yes and no. I think what COVID kind of it sparked a memory in the ALP of how they used to operate and how they used to take issues like genuine full employment seriously, as was demonstrated by the H.C. Coombs white paper after World War II, when there was a program by Labor for genuine full employment where unemployment was kept below 2%.
Yes, well, I guess MMT is the lens which says to us we can have full employment and low inflation, and it tells us that we can have that by having a job guarantee and by spending on universal basic services. And so I guess if we have this alternative way of managing inflation, that is, we manage inflation by a pool of employed job guarantee people, not by a pool of unemployed people, and that we're simply spending enough to have all that, then the question is, how do we get this captured neoliberal Labor government to implement a job guarantee and to spend enough to have a well-functioning public service? Even how do we get both sides of government to do this? Because we know, Kevin, that they've been ignoring these solutions for decades.
Yeah. Owen is certainly enthusiastic about challenging that, and so are a lot of us, but not enough of us. Yeah.
If I had the answer, Kevin, I would have won the lotto, I reckon. But certainly Owen is seeing the direction that we need to head. So he's talking about building a left-leaning movement which has no fear of embarrassing the Labor government. So he's saying that's where we went wrong after Labor was elected, because once they were elected, everyone went quiet. Again, it was that issue of trying to look unified as the left.
Yeah, the whole thing about being unified. I guess one of the main criticisms that I have of the Labor Party with their adoption of neoliberalism is that they seem very reluctant to challenge the narrative. And they could, and they should be. They should be supporting progressive social well-being initiatives in their narrative. But you've got Labor attacking the Greens over being too progressive with some of their policies. That to me is a huge disappointment.
I think Owen was pointing out a weak chink in this neoliberal armour that the Labor Party and others seem to be wearing, and that is that since they started talking about genuine full employment since the COVID spending, that they all have to pretend, at least on paper, that they want genuine full employment. So the chink in their armour is that we can hold them to these declarations, and just use a bit of activist jiu-jitsu to send the energy that they do have that we like in the direction that we want. And I just expect that some organisations will be more eager than others to amplify the message around genuine full employment. But I think it's a great strategy, you just take someone at face value.
Yeah. And if anything can be done to remind Labor of their origins and of what they should be doing, point out to them that they've gone a little bit too far down the neoliberal rabbit hole and they need to come back out again.
Let's head back to our conversation with Owen Bennett. So we were talking about what was going on just after COVID, and you mentioned that documents that are being produced, for example, by the ACTU, they are talking about genuine full employment. And I went and had a look at the full employment document that was produced out of the ACTU's Congress of 2024. And in that document, they stated that Congress holds that full employment means a situation where everyone willing to work should be able to find a good, secure and fairly paid job without having to search for too long. And that phrase, without having to search for too long, jumped out at me because it's just not like your regular bureaucracy speak, which, I thought they might say something more like within a reasonable time period. And so aside from the fact that they're kind of okay that unemployment might last for any length of time, and, even aside from wondering about what their definition of too long might be, given that the definition of long-term unemployment has mutated in recent times from 3 months to 12 months, I then realised I'd come across this odd little phrase in another place, which was in a document that was the statement of conduct between the Reserve Bank Board and the government. And in this statement of conduct, we read that the government's objective is sustained and inclusive full employment where everyone who wants a job can find one without searching for too long. And I'm like, this odd little phrase is doing the rounds. And I just wondered if there was anything to that, what we might read into this policy meme.
Yeah, that phrase is really infuriating in how vague it is. And I first noticed it when the Labor Party produced its white paper on employment, which was formerly called the Full Employment White Paper, but then they changed the name of it. In that, the big statement was we want everyone to have a job without searching for too long.
Oh, it was also in that.
Yeah,
okay.
So that was where I first noticed it, and I was like, really clenching my fist. Like, can't they just define it? Because it sets us back somewhat when we haven't pinned them down about what they actually believe. Because if they put out a statement saying we think everyone should have a job that wants one, then we can use that and say, well, why don't you do that? But because they've got this open-ended,
they've got some wriggle room, haven't they?
Yeah, well, it could mean anything. Like at the moment, the average time spent on job seeker is about 4.5 years. And that's a payment, deep below the poverty line. And the fact that the government are currently trying to push up unemployment right now, that suggests that they're happy with that level of length. Because I haven't heard anyone talk about the duration of unemployment today being a problem, even though they're talking about without having to search for too long. So, that's a perfect example of where a strong, well-organised movement could definitely find out exactly what they mean by that and press them on that. And this is a real failure of the media that they haven't done that. Because that's...
We're the media.
We're the media, aren't we, Kevin?
Yeah.
It's a very, very simple question. And every time, Chalmers gets on a program, he should be asked that question. Like, what do you mean by that? How long is too long? And the reason why they don't say that is because the whole jig would be up if they had to answer that question. It's kind of like the reason why the government doesn't have a formal definition of poverty, because the whole jig would be up. So there's these areas where the government is so vulnerable, and I've noticed on the poverty line issue there has been some good campaigning going on, trying to get the government to have a definition of poverty, a novel concept, and that should also be expanded to a definition of what they mean by full employment, because that definition is just a joke.
I can just see a campaign with people holding up signs. Albanese, I hope we're going to talk to you, and I hope we don't have to wait for too long.
And then have the Centrelink hold music.
That's right, the Centrelink hold music.
You're listening to 3CR 855 AM on digital and on the internet, www.3cr.org.au.
I picked up a second-hand book just recently, written in 1989. It was called The Hawke-Keating Hijack by Dean Jaensch, Jaensch, and it talks about the Labor Party and how Labor had abandoned its ideology and gone to the middle ground even back then. There's a very interesting quote. It says, take the following comment, for example. The Australian Labor Party does not even claim to be a socialist party. As a matter of fact, it is a liberal bourgeois party. This could well have emerged from the Victorian socialist left in the 1980s. It was, in fact, the view of Lenin in 1913. It represents the purely non-socialist trade union workers. So we can see that even from the inception of the Labor Party, that it's having this struggle with whether it's socialist or not, whether it's for workers or not. And I think how this book describes it, it says that the Labor Party starts off as a mass party with members who have elected representatives who are there to represent workers. But then over time, it turns into what it calls a catch-all party or a populist party, which is kind of adopting the strategy of the Liberal Party, which was always openly that way. So the Liberal Party asks the electorate, what do you want? And let us do it for you. We're the best ones to do it. Their main concern in the Liberal Party is to secure power, and policy is something that they'll figure out afterwards when they speak to the electorate. But they just presume that they'll be better at doing it.
Speak to their donors.
Whereas the Labor Party was a party that represented workers and elected representatives from each state, and through the unions, they were very ideological. They had a set of values, and that ideology seems to have been compromised and evaporated in the same kind of quest as the Liberal Party, which is to win the election so that they can do something. And for them, that means, in this environment, it means tinkering at the edges. And it's got to the point now where I thought that they were captured by neoliberalism, so they had to pay lip service to it just to sound like they were in the same conversation, which has been dictated by the Murdoch media, etc. But now, when they embrace things like the NIRU, the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, when a Labor Party actively throws people into unemployment to so-called keep a lid on inflation, which, as we know, is code for increasing profits, that to me is a step too far. That is a party that isn't just trying to fit into the neoliberal narrative, but it's a party that's lost its ideology.
It's actively supporting the neoliberal
Yeah,
ideology.
as we say, it's become neoliberal light. Look, some people have known this for ages, and I guess it's just dawning on me on how.
I'm seeing this shift in you, Kevin, over the months and years as we look more and more into what the false economics is. Yeah.
Well, I was a member of the Labor Party for 20 years. When Howard kept on winning elections, I thought join a party and become involved. And there's lots of good people in the Labor Party, and I don't think even a lot of the people in the Labor Party understand how captured or how subservient it is to neoliberalism. There are people there who would like to do more and think that they're doing more by being part of that party. But as you understand the structure of the party, it's strong on unity. And so when the leadership of the Labor Party takes a direction, everybody has to fall in line because disunity is death. This is kind of like a union mantra that they still hold to.
It is an organising mantra. There is strength in numbers. Yeah.
Yeah. But what it means now is that when the leadership starts adopting and promoting neoliberal policies and ideology like the NIRU, they will fall into line. Everybody will hold that line.
They pull everyone with them. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's kind of where they are now. They've gone a long way into neoliberal territory, and I think they're getting comfortable there.
So true. We do focus on the Labor Party and the federal government because they are the ones that are in control of the public purse, which is this ability to create Australian dollars when you spend. So that's why we look often at the federal government and at the Labor Party. But I would suspect that there are a lot of left-leaning progressive civil organisations also that think they're doing good, but they end up shooting themselves in the foot or being counterproductive because they're also captured by the neoliberal economics.
Yeah, and I guess what we're trying to do with a show like this and what the MMT movement is trying to do as a whole is open people's eyes to some of the genuine social well-being opportunities that are available. If we can just lift this veil of we can't afford this and we can't afford that because of this neoliberal doctrine. And it starts with unemployment.
Yeah, well, speaking of books, Kevin, I did say I would bring in my copy of Modern Monetary Theory, Bill and Warren's Excellent Adventure by the adventurers themselves, William Mitchell and Warren Mosler, the co-founders of Modern Monetary Theory. And I've been underlining almost, half the book here while I've been reading it. But I just thought I'd read one little quote from page 80. And they say, "For Bill and Warren, understanding the monetary system turns residual unemployment into a crime against humanity." They don't pull punches, those guys.
That's quite a comment, isn't it? And the thing you get from this book is how the unemployed are treated and felt as if they're a valuable part of society. It underpins your whole, not just economy, but your whole sense of purpose and
it's your whole
sense of
social
connection.
fabric.
Yeah, it reflects across the whole of society.
Yeah, it's true collectivism.
It is, and that's the theme of the whole book. It runs the whole way through. The bottom line is unemployment.
Well, definitely recommend people get a hold of it if they are looking for a juicy read about full employment.
Yeah, that's a good read.
So we are running out of time here, Kev, but we will continue our conversation with Owen about full employment activism, past and present, next time we catch up with each other.
I think I need to get back to the beaches, and I've felt a bit grumpy on this show. That's because I haven't had a swim with the dolphins and the whales for a little bit too long.
Oh, you haven't been able to put the boardies on and go for a body swim.
I didn't wear my boardies last time. It was deserted beaches and I didn't need to.
Oh, such a difference when you get back to civilization.
Anyway, till next time, Anne.
Till next time, Kev, and I hope it won't be in too long.
Sure. Speak to you then. Bye.
You've been listening to Radio MMT with Anne and Kev.
We'd love your feedback. Email us on radiommt@gmail.com or search Radio MMT on social media.
Listen to this show anytime, wherever you get your podcasts, or on 3cr.org.au/Radio MMT.
Support this show and the station by subscribing to 3cr.org.au and mention Radio MMT.
We thank all our guests.
And we thank economist Professor Bill Mitchell and his mmted.org, educating the masses on modern monetary theory.
And thank you to our listeners for listening. And I thank you, Kevin.
And I thank you, Anne. So what's planned for next week?
Kevin, there is still so much to talk about. We've got to expose all this rotten economics.
Well, that's good, and I get it. Do you reckon we could use a bit more music?
Well, I made a list of all these terrible economic theories. Like, I've heard of the theory of comparative advantage, or the quantity theory of money, or the loanable funds theory.
Have you heard of a band called Single Gun Theory? Like, they're a really good band. I'm sure there's a whole range of, like, macroeconomic music that I could bring into the show.
Yeah, but we really need to do marginal productivity theory, not to mention the natural rate of unemployment and the money multiplier.
You've got a pretty good singing voice. I play bass. Bill, he plays guitar. I reckon we could form a macroeconomics band. Like, we could deliver this whole message by music.
Well, we could call the band the Permanent Income Hypothesis, or the Ricardian Equivalence, or Rational Expectations.
I think we're onto something here. We're trying to make macroeconomics more interesting to the masses. We're going to form this band and sing it to them. And we're going to bring the economists in. We're going to get music.
You've been listening to a 3CR podcast produced in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.